Hi everyone, and today we are on page 146 of The Hobbit. The dwarves and Gandalf had just got to Bjorn's house and they were sitting down for something to eat. So let's see what happens next. Inside the hall it was now quite dark. Bjorn clapped his hands and in trotted 4 beautiful white ponies and several large long-bodied grey dogs. Bjorn said something to them in a queer language like animal noises turned into talk. They went out again and soon came back carrying torches in their mouths, which they lit at the fire and stuck in low brackets on the pillars of the hall about the central hearth. The dogs could stand on their hind legs when they wished and carry things with their forefeet. Quickly they got out boards and trestles from the side walls and set them up near the fire. Then baa, baa, baa was heard, and in came some snow-white sheep led by a large coal-black ram. One bore a white cloth embroidered at the edges with figures of animals. Other bore on their broad backs trays with bowls and platters and knives and wooden spoons, which the dogs took quickly and laid on the trestle tables. These were very low, low enough even for Bilbo to sit at comfortably. Beside them a pony pushed 2 low-seated benches with wide rush bottoms and little short thick legs for Gandalf and Thorin, while at the far end he put Bjorn's big black chair of the same sort, in which he sat with his great legs stuck far out under the table. These were all the chairs he had in his hall, and he probably had them low like the tables for the convenience of the wonderful animals that waited on him. Where did the rest sit on? They were not forgotten. The other ponies came in rolling round drum-shaped sections of logs, smoothed and polished and low enough even for Bilbo. So soon they were all seated at Bjorn's table, and the hall had not seen such a gathering for many a year. There they had a supper, or a dinner, such as they had not had since they left the last homely house in the west and said goodbye to Elrond. The light of the torches and the fires flickered around them, and on the table were 2 tall red beeswax candles. All the time they ate. Bjorn, in his deep rolling voice, told tales of the wild lands on this side of the mountains, and especially of the dark and dangerous woods that lay outstretched far to north and south, a day's ride before them, bearing their way to the east, the terrible forest of Mirkwood. The dwarfs listened and shook their beards, for they knew that they must soon venture into that forest, and that after the mountains it was the worst of the perils they had to pass before they came to the dragon's stronghold. When dinner was over, they began to tell tales of their own, but Bjorn seemed to be growing drowsy and paid little heed to them. They spoke most of gold and silver and jewels, and the making of things by smith craft, and Bjorn did not appear to care for such things. There were no things of gold or silver in his hall, and few save the knives were made of metal at all. They sat long at the table with their wooden drinking bowls filled with mead. The dark night came on outside. The fires in the middle of the hall were built with fresh logs, and the torches were put out, and still they sat in the light of the dancing flames, with the pillars of the house standing tall behind them, and dark at the top like trees of the forest. Whether it was magic or not, it seemed to Bilbo that he heard a sound like wind in the branches stirring in the rafters and the hoots of owls. Soon he began to nod with sleep, and the voices seemed to grow far away until he woke with a start. The great door had creaked and slammed. Bjorn was gone. The dwarfs were sitting cross-legged on the floor round the fire, and presently they began to sing. Some of the verses were like this, and there were many more, and their singing went on for a long while. The wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. Their shadows lay by night and day, and dark things silent crept beneath. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled. The branches groaned, the forest moaned, and leaves were laid upon the mould. The wind went on from west to east, all movement in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh its whistling voices were released. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, on it went, over shaken pool, under heaven's call, where racing clouds were torn and rent. It passed the lonely mountain bare, and swept above the dragon's lair. There black and dark lay boulders stark, and flying smoke was in the air. It left the world and took its flight over the wide seas of the night. The moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping light. Bilbo began to nod again. Suddenly up stood Gandalf. "It is time for us to sleep," he said. "For us, but not, I think, for Bjorn. In this hall we can rest sound and safe, but I warn you all not to forget what Bjorn said before he left us. You must not stray outside until the sun is up, on your peril." Bilbo found the bed had already been laid at the side of the hall, on a sort of raised platform between the pillars and the outer wall. For him there was a little mattress of straw and woolen blankets. He snuggled into them very gladly. Summer-time though it was. The fire burned low and he fell asleep, yet in the night he woke. The fire had now sunk to a few embers. The dwarfs and Gandalf were all asleep, to judge by their breathing. A splash of white on the floor came from the high moon, which was peering down through the smoke hole in the roof. There was a growling sound outside and a noise as of some great animal scuffling at the door. Bilbo wondered what it was and whether it could be Bjorn in enchanted shape, and if he could come in as a bear and kill them. He dived under the blankets and hid his head and fell asleep again, at last, in spite of his fears. It was full morning when he awoke. One of the dwarfs had fallen over him in the shadows where he lay and had rolled down with a bump from the platform onto the floor. It was Bofa, and he was grumbling about it when Bilbo opened his eyes. "Get up, lazy bones," he said, "or there'll be no breakfast left for you." Up jumped Bilbo. "Breakfast?" he cried. "Where is breakfast?" "Mostly inside us," answered the other dwarfs who were moving about the hall. "But what is left is out on the veranda. We've been out about looking for Bjorn ever since the sun got up, but there's no sign of him anywhere, though we found breakfast laid as soon as we went out." "Where is Gandalf?" asked Bilbo, moving off to find something to eat as quick as he could. "Oh, out and about somewhere," they told him. But he saw no sign of the wizard all that day until the evening. Just before sunset, he walked into the hall where the Hobbit and the dwarfs were having supper, waited on by Bjorn's wonderful animals, and they had been all day. Of Bjorn they had seen and heard nothing since the night before, and they were all getting puzzled. "Where is our host, and where have you been yourself?" they all cried. "One question at a time, and none till after supper. I haven't had a bite since breakfast." At last Gandalf pushed away his plate and jug. He'd eaten 2 whole loaves with masses of butter and honey and clotted cream, and drunk at least a quart of mead, and he took out his pipe. "I will answer the second question first," he said, "but bless me, this is a splendid place for smoke rings." Indeed, for a long time they could get nothing more out of him. He was so busy sending smoke rings dodging round the pillars of the hall, changing them into all sorts of different shapes and colours, and setting them at last chasing one another out of the hole in the roof. They must have looked very queer from outside, popping out into the air, one after another. Green, blue, red, silver grey, yellow, white, big ones, little ones dodging through big ones and joining into figure 8s, and going off like a flock of birds into the distance. "I have been picking out bear tracks," he said at last. "There must have been a regular bears' meeting outside here last night. I soon saw that Bjorn could not have made them all. There were far too many of them, and they were of various sizes too. I should say there were little bears, large bears, ordinary bears, and gigantic big bears, all dancing outside from dark to nearly dawn. They came from almost every direction, except from the west over the river from the mountains. In that direction only one set of footprints led, none coming, only ones going away from here. I followed these as far as the Carrack." There they disappeared into the river, but the water was too deep and strong beyond the rock for me to cross. It is easy enough, as you remember, to get from this bank to the Corrick by the ford, but on the other side is a cliff standing up from a swelling channel. I had to walk miles before I found a place where the river was wide and shallow enough for me to wade and swim, and then miles back again to pick up the tracks again. By that time it was too late for me to follow them far. They went straight off in the direction of the pine woods on the east side of the Misty Mountains, where we had our pleasant little party with the wargs the night before last. And now I think I've answered your first question too," ended Gandalf, and he sat for a long while, silent. Bilbo thought he knew what the wizard meant. "What shall we do?" he cried. "If he leads all the wargs and the goblins down here, we shall all be caught and killed. I thought you said he was a friend of theirs." "So I did, and don't be silly. You had better go to bed. Your wits are sleepy." The Hobbit felt quite crushed, and as there seemed nothing else to do, he did go to bed, and while the dwarfs were still singing songs, he dropped to sleep, still puzzling his little head about Bjorn, till he dreamed a dream of hundreds of black bears dancing slow, heavy dances round and round in the moonlight in the courtyard. Then he woke up when everyone else was asleep, and he heard the same scrapping, scuffling, snuffling and growling as before. Next morning they were all wakened by Bjorn himself. "So here you all still are," he said. He picked up the Hobbit and laughed. "Not eaten up by wargs or goblins or wicked bears yet, I see." And he poked Mr. Baggins' waistcoat most disrespectfully. "Little Bunny's getting nice and fat again on bread and honey," he chuckled. "Come and have some more." So they all went to breakfast with him. Bjorn was most jolly for a change. Indeed, he seemed to be in a splendidly good humour and set them all laughing with his funny stories. Nor did they have to wonder long where he'd been or why. He was so nice to them, for he told them himself. He'd been over the river and right back up into the mountains, from which you can guess that he can travel quickly, in bear shape at any rate. From the burnt wharf glade, he had soon found out that part of their story was true, but he'd found more than that. He had caught a warg and a goblin wandering in the woods. From there he had got news. The goblin patrols were still hunting with wargs for the dwarfs, and they were fiercely angry because of the death of the great goblin, and also because of the burning of the chief wolf's nose and the death from the wizard's fire of many of his chief servants. So much they told him when he forced them, but he guessed there was more wickedness than this afoot, and that a great raid of the whole goblin army with their wolf allies into the lands shadowed by the mountains might soon be made to find the dwarfs, or to take vengeance on the men and